Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm sure we are in many parts of the world. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this very important webinar. I think legal identity, as we all know, is an important component of accessing your own rights and making governments accountable to their citizens. So we shall hear more about that from Francesca's opening remarks. But we know that there have been a lot of investments put into civil registration and vital statistics in the world, with either notable improvements or successes, but we also have had some challenges, and hopefully we shall hear about those today in today's webinar. So the investments really give us an opportunity to address inequalities, women empowerment, and of course, access to the rights that every human being needs to have. So proof of identity often is challenging because of the various factors that can impact on it, and adding questions, for example, in mechanisms of data collection like censuses and household surveys are also opportunities in which we can improve access to data on legal identity. So today we shall be privileged to hear from our colleague Romesh Silva, our technical specialist on CRVS here in UNICEF, UNFPA New York. Sorry, I just moved from UNICEF, so pardon my slip of tongue. And then we shall hear some very insightful lessons from Zambia, and a discussion will follow after that. But before that, let me invite my colleague and friend, Francesca Groom, to give us some opening remarks. Francesca, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Priscilla. Greetings from New York, from me too. I'm Francesca Groom. I'm Assistant Director at the UN Statistics Division, where I lead the Social and Demographic Statistics Program. And I'm very happy to say just some introductory remarks on this crucial topic that will be discussed at the 5th webinar organized by the UN-LIA Task Force. So today we'll talk about estimating and assessing the number and characteristics of individuals lacking official proof of legal identity. So as many of you are aware, and as just mentioned by Priscilla, legal identity is not only recognized as a means to achieve inclusive, sustainable development, it is also a fundamental development outcome on its own. However, despite this global acknowledgement that everyone has the right to be recognized as a person before the law, there are still hundreds of millions of people who lack this fundamental human right. So today we meet to explore this topic, and in particular to discuss available data sources and different analytical methods for estimating the number of people without proof of legal identity. So these are individuals lacking essential documents such as a birth certificate, an identity card, or other digital identity credentials. Of course, the discussion in this webinar is highly relevant to the work of the UN Legal Identity Agenda, or UN-LIA. And I don't know how familiar our audience is with this group or with the initiative itself that was established in 2018 by the Deputy Secretary General. And the UN-LIA task force is comprised of more than 13 UN agencies, all working together for a few years now to assist countries in their efforts towards achieving SDG 16.9, which calls for legal identity for all, including birth registration by 2030. From our side, from the perspective of DESA Statistics Division, we remain deeply committed to the UN-LIA Task Force as co-chair, together with UNDP and UNICEF of this group. as well as a custodian of international statistical recommendations and methodological guidelines for developing and maintaining civil registration, vital statistics, and ID management systems. As for this series of webinars, today is the 5th session. We believe that they are crucial for translating these standards and conceptual frameworks into actionable solutions at the country level. And I really hope, I really trust that the presentations and discussions today will provide guidance to UN country teams and national governments. Maybe Lisa, you can also give us a glance, an idea of who is in the room with us, to make sure that we get to an effective implementation of the UN legal identity agenda on the ground. So to wrap up, in our session, we will touch on and address critical questions such as how to use censuses, surveys, and administrative records to assess the completeness of proof of legal identity, or in other words, how these sources can help estimate the number of people without a birth certificate or other proof of legal identity, and shed light on unequal access to registration. I encourage all of you to actively engage, to ask questions and share your experience. And I really look forward to a fruitful and insightful discussion throughout the webinar. Thank you. Thank you, Priscilla.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for those insightful remarks and to give us a very nice opening to our webinar. So now I'll pass over to Romesh to give a presentation on UNFPA's data and methodology on assessing populations lacking legal identity. Over to you, Romesh.
Let me just confirm, maybe you could give me a thumbs up or acknowledgement that the slides are visible and in full screen. Great, okay, thanks. Well, thanks so much, Priscilla and Francesca and Risa, to kick us off. Without further ado, what I will speak about is some of the research and analysis that we've been doing at UNFPA's Center of Excellence for CRVS systems, specifically looking at how do we understand who is being left out of legal identity systems, and what data can be used to understand and to measure who's in and who's out, and what insights can be gleaned from this type of analysis. And let me acknowledge this is joint work with Sumaya Taibi, who will also present in a moment. So let's see if I can, great. So I think Francesca has already, Francesca and Priscilla have already, framed the discussion quite nicely, but let me, just go into a little bit more detail. Everyone has the right to be recognized as a person before the law. That's really what we're here to engage and to strengthen. And we're grounded by the International Human Rights Conventions, particularly Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is encapsulated very explicitly in 2 SDG outcome indicators, both SDG 16, which sets out a goal for universal legal identity by 2030. And then secondly, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, indicator 17.19.2, which in addition to highlighting the importance of decennial census rounds, highlights the importance of universal civil registration, particularly birth and death registration. But one other thing to really recognize is that universal legal identity is not only a goal, a sustainable development goal in and of itself, but it's also a means to achieve a number of other sustainable development goals in the 2030 agenda. Just to highlight, universal legal identity is widely recognized as really supporting efforts to end all forms of poverty, goal number 1, goal number 3 in terms of promoting healthy lives and well-being, and also advancing SDG 5, gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. And then lastly, but certainly by no means least, universal legal identity is absolutely critical for this leave no one behind principle of reducing inequalities and vulnerabilities, both within and between countries. And we'll go into a lot more about that in terms of the measurement issues. Just to highlight the, as we've already said, the SDG 1691, the actual official indicator is the proportion of children under 5 years of age whose births have been registered with a civil authority. But one thing to recognize is that although, we can all agree that birth registration and actually birth certification are critically important, critical entry points for universal legal identity, I wanted to just highlight that the UN Principles and Recommendations for Vital Statistic Systems recognizes 10 core vital events, births through to deaths, but also key events like marriage, divorce, judicial separation, adoption. And so one thing, a key part of the UN Legal Identity Agenda is to take a life course approach to universal legal identity and recognize that not only is the health system critical, but there are various authorized institutions, including things like ministries of justice and courts and judicial institutions, which play a critical role in ensuring universal legal identity. And then another point to identify is that not only are many countries strengthening their civil registration system, but they're also investing in national ID management systems, which are often authenticated by biometric technologies and other verification technologies, and are increasingly being linked, civil registration systems and national ID systems, through population registers, which themselves are periodically updated through population and housing censuses. One of the key things which the UN Legal Identity Agenda Task Force has achieved in its tenure is articulating and the concept and the definition of proof of legal identity. It's defined as a credential, such as a birth certificate, ID card, or it could be a digital ID credential that is recognized as proof of legal identity under national law and in accordance with emerging international norms and principles. And this is important to recognize that this was adopted by the UN Legal Identity Agenda Task Force and then endorsed by the Economic and Social Council of the UN. And so before that, we actually didn't have an internationally recognized conceptual definition of legal identity and proof of legal identity. What that does is it paves the way for coherent and clearer measurement and assessment. Our colleagues at the World Bank Group have done quite a bit of work on this, and they recently updated their estimates, and they've focused more on doing global and country level estimates, and they've concluded that there are around 850 million people who lack proof of legal ID. And I'll go into how these estimates were constructed. But the thing to highlight here, which is very informative, is that from their analysis, they highlight that most of the people lacking proof of legal identity, somewhat unsurprisingly, are concentrated in low-income and lower middle-income countries, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But also that half of the population lacking proof of legal ID are minors, are children whose births haven't been registered. One of the things that we've been doing is trying to understand, how to interpret these data and estimates from the World Bank. what I'm showing you here is a scatter plot, which on the x-axis is x and y-axis are showing two different methods which the World Bank uses to estimate proof of legal identity. On the x-axis, they're using administrative data from national ID systems, birth registration systems, and voter registration systems. And on the y-axis, they're using what's called a Findex survey through the Gallup Opinion Poll. And so in an ideal world, what we'd expect is all of these country estimates shown by orange circles, and those are proportional to the population of each country. We'd want them to line up on the 45-degree line, no matter whether the completeness of proof of legal identity is low, medium, or high. But what we see is that while some countries line up on the 45-degree line, meaning that the estimates from the two methods are consistent, many don't. And some countries, Gallup Opinion Poll overestimates relative to the administrative data, but in other countries, it's the exact opposite. So notable inconsistencies here, just when we look at these data and estimates at the country level. And so through the UN Legal Identity Agenda and the Center of Excellence for CRBS Systems, what we've been doing is really focusing on three research questions. What can we learn about proof of legal ID completeness from available census, survey, and administrative data? Secondly, how consistent are the census-based estimates with alternative data and estimates? And then thirdly, how can we harness these kinds of census and survey data to advance inequality analysis of proof of legal ID coverage? Okay, and I'll go through each of these three pieces in this talk. But as a background, let me highlight, because we're sitting here with our great friends and colleagues at the UN Statistics Division, and there's really a well-established set of methods and literature articulated by many UN standards and manuals on measuring the completeness of birth registration, death registration, coverage of population registers, and how inclusive things like population and housing censuses are. What we're seeing right now is there's a lot of catch-up work to do in terms of really developing the literature and the methodology to measure completeness assessment of proof of legal ID. And that's what I'll focus on today. As we know, in most countries, what happens is that proof of legal ID is supposed to be granted through the issuance of a birth certificate at birth. And then in many countries, somewhere between the ages of 15 or 16 and anywhere between 18 or 21, people become eligible for a national ID credential. In the case here of Nigeria, that happens at age 16. And these are the two mechanisms. And so in terms of what can we learn about proof of ID completeness from survey, census, and administrative data, one of the things to identify is that in many censuses, what we see is that some countries collect information about birth registration and birth certification. For example, here, you can see that in Peru in 2007, Ecuador in 2010, Zambia in 2010, these are countries which I added a direct question on do these individuals, in some cases, in the cases of Peru and Ecuador, this was for the entire enumerated population, no matter what age. In the case of Zambia, it was only for people under the age of 18. Do they have a birth certificate? Yes or no? In the case of Zambia, not just yes or no and don't know, but yes, and it was seen, it was reviewed by the enumerator. So that's for children. For adults, we see that many countries have also added a question on proof of legal ID for adults in terms of a national ID credential or a national ID card. In many cases, the cutoff age is calibrated to be consistent with when people become eligible for a national ID card. And in most countries, this is a binary yes or no. On the far right, you see what this looks like in Myanmar, where there are many, many different types of national ID cards, depending on whether you're a citizen or a naturalized citizen, or foreign resident, etc., etc. And so there in the census that has been delineated. There's about around 15 countries worldwide that have, in the last couple of census rounds, included these kinds of questions. I'm just giving you a snapshot here of some of the countries because I can't fit everything into this slide, but we'll share all these details after the webinar. The thing to understand and identify here is that, there's many covariates, in terms of demographic details like sex and age, and then socioeconomic characteristics like ethnicity, rural, urban, disability status, which are also sometimes collected as part of these efforts. What this looks like in terms of the data is a fairly rich overview. And here what I'm showing you is just if you disaggregate these data for different censuses, right? Here you see for each country going down the y-axis here, so Zambia at the top, India, right down to Honduras, you can see how dispersed the subnational estimates of proof of legal ID are. This is a little bit hard to see, so let me just zoom in and show you what, and really compare Zambia and Honduras. In Zambia at the top, what we see is a wide variation. Anything from, if you're under 16, only about 10% of Zambians under 16 have a proof of legal ID. Whereas if you're, for example, in the age group of 40 to 50, it's well over 90% proof of legal ID completeness. And then there's a whole bunch of variation in between. Contrast that with Honduras, where we see this country almost has universal legal identity. So of course, therefore, arithmetically, we see very, very little subnational variability and subnational disparity in terms of proof of legal ID. Take-home message here is that the census is a really, really powerful tool to understand who's in and who's out, and what some of the key characteristics that are driving exclusion. And just to highlight again, as you can see from each data point, we can disaggregate one by different variables, by age, ethnicity, geographic region, marital status, and you can see that consistently across many of these countries, the age groups that are consistently overrepresented in terms of lack of proof of legal ID are young children, people under the age of 18 usually. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to move ahead here to the next part of the presentation. And
you have 5 more minutes.
Thanks a lot, Priscilla.
Yeah.
So in the interest of time, let me quickly get into part 2 and part 3 in terms of the consistency of the census data and estimates and alternative data. So as we've already discussed, a key piece here in terms of comparing with estimates by the World Bank is to understand that they've put together what they call the ID4D global data set. So in the left-hand column of this table, this is put together from administrative data of, in terms of the inclusion in the birth register and the national ID system, or in some countries, the voter register is used as a proxy. And then alternatively, an add-on question in this Findex survey administered through the Gallup World Opinion Poll. And what we see when we look at many, many countries, and what I invite you to do is focus on the far left-hand column for Zambia, right? What you see is that you get really different results depending on which data source and which estimation method you use. So for example, if you used the ID4D Findex survey, so the Gallup Opinion Poll or the census, you'd conclude in Zambia that proof of legal ID was around 80% complete. Whereas, if you actually relied on the administrative data of the national ID system and the birth register, you conclude that it's actually about 40% complete. And so the point here is to say that the data source and the measurement method matter a great deal in terms of how we do this. And that's even more so the case when it comes to what we see here, just to quickly identify, is that when you look at the child population versus the adult population, you can see across censuses and surveys, there's a lot of consistency in terms of that there hasn't actually been a lot of progress in Zambia in terms of improvement of the birth register. Whereas when you look at the national ID system, right, you see that you definitely, can conclude that there's been some improvement. But the question is, has it been dramatic improvement from about 50% to 85% completeness, or modest improvement from about 78% to 85%? And that's not clear in terms of the data consistency issues. Let me turn to inequality analysis, and really about leave no one behind. So one thing that one can do here is, with census and survey data, is conduct what we call disparity analysis in terms of who has proof of legal ID, using what are called classification and regression tree algorithms. So here what we're measuring as an outcome measure is proof of legal ID, binary, yes or no. And the factors that we're measuring which influence that are things collected through the census and surveys, like disability status, ethnicity, geographic region, age, and sex. And this is what the data look like in Zambia. So what we're showing here is who's the green arms of the tree is showing you who are the most advantaged, and the red arm is showing who are the most disadvantaged populations, right? And so in Zambia, immediately you see that this is a story of real problems with the birth register, and that as soon as people hit age somewhere between age 17 and 20, they come into the system in terms of proof of legal ID. And so this is really helping us to identify that the intervention here really needs to focus on minors, particularly young children, and shoring up proof of legal identity in those early child and adolescent years. If we do the same kind of analysis in India, again, we identify who's furthest behind. And what's interesting in India is this is less so, a question, a first order question about age, but more so a question of specific states in India where the legal ID system is extremely poor, particularly Assam and Meghalaya. But then, in some, and whereas in the other regions, the most included population tends to be persons over the age of about 11. Okay. So again, here the main factor in terms of identifying disparity is actually place, as opposed to in Zambia, where it's more age. And the thing to understand here is that these are multivariate analyses. So what the analysis is doing here is we're organizing the data to identify where are the greatest disparities, order by order. So again, I've already said this, this is really helps us to identify what are the factors for who's furthest left behind, and what are the policy implications in terms of, really improving the inclusiveness of civil registration and national ID systems. So let me wrap up by really, summarizing. There's multiple ways to assess proof of legal identity completeness. What we can see already is that there's no perfect method, and there are real problems with the data. But we do need, need to harness this holistic life course approach when we're assessing proof of legal ID. And the census and household surveys, particularly the 2020 census round, which is now closing, and the 2030 census round, which will soon begin, really provide an opportunity for better baseline, midterm, and periodic assessments. Not only cross-sectionally, but lastly, through multivariate analysis like these classification and regression trees, which really help us to understand who's furthest left behind, so that there can be more of an equity-based approach to focus on the furthest behind first when it comes to strengthening legal ID systems. Thanks so much. Back to you, Priscilla.
Thank you. Thanks, Romesh, for that exposition of the methodology and all the results that have been produced from this excellent analysis. I will now pass over to sharing of some lessons from Zambia. Our colleagues Somaya and Chinyama will present. Welcome.
Thank you very much. This presentation today focuses on the main findings of a pilot study conducted in Zambia, where we wanted to assess legal identity questions that were in the draft questionnaire for the Zambian 2022 census. This pilot study was conducted in Zambia in December 2021 by the UNFPA Center of Excellence for CRVS Systems, the UNFPA Zambia Country Office, and the University of Zambia. So Zambia is a somewhat unique case study because it is one of the countries, if not the only country, who has measured the position of legal identity in 3 consecutive censuses. However, there is a difference between how this question was included in each census. So, for instance, in the 2010 census, the question targeted all citizens, whereas in the 2010 census, they only targeted citizens, whereas in the 2000 and in the 2022 census, all the population was targeted, including both citizens and non-citizens. Another difference is that the question about birth certificate position was included in the 2010 and 2022 censuses, but not in the 2000 census. This question is really important as it complements the national ID question, because in Zambia, national ID eligibility only starts at age 16. So when we look at the data from 2010 that is on the screen, we can see, as Romesh stated in his presentation, that birth certificate position is systematically low in Zambia. It's around 10%, whereas the national identity card position is around 84%. And another thing that we observe is a delay in getting a national ID card. And we see that that delay is present both in the data from 2000 and in the data from 2010. And we see that this, the population aged 16 to 20 is left behind, is the furthest left behind. So now if we focus on the change that that happened from 2000 to 2010, we will see that, first of all, although we look at the national average that has increased from around 78% to 84%, those national averages actually mask substantial differences on the subnational level. However, the range of those differences at the subnational level have significantly shrinked from 2000 to 2010. We see also that we have the green lines that highlights the subpopulations where we can see that the position of proof of legal identity has improved. And an example of that is the population aged 16 to 20, whereas the red lines show subpopulations where we are not able to detect notable progress in the position of legal identity. And here I will pass to Chinyama to present.
Thank you very much. The study looked at 3 things in terms of the objectives. 1, how reliable and valid are the census questions on the birth certificate possession as well as the national registration card possession. And the second one is that how might local languages shape perceptions and the understanding of these census questions on the proof of legal identity. Then the third one is how can the questionnaire wording and response categories be designed to ensure participation and accurate responses from the population of interest. So what we see from the study in terms of the findings as they relate to the what influences the quality of the survey responses were mainly 2 things. One is on the knowledge about birth registration and birth certification rather than the language employed. We see a conflation between different types of documents. For instance, people have challenges understanding the difference between the birth record as well as the and the birth certificate. And then the other thing under this point is that we have seen a conflation between the understanding and knowledge of what birth registration is and what birth notification is, and the other issue is the familiarity of colloquial terms surrounding birth registration and birth certification. So what we see in the questionnaire, the census questionnaire, is under variable P34. We'll see there's a question that is asked whether a person has a birth certificate. And P36, we see whether the person, there's a question that asks whether the person has a national registration card. And you see under P36, you see that one responses 1 to 3. We'll even disaggregate what kind of national registration card that is. Green for Zambian nationals, pink for Commonwealth nationals, and the blue for non-Commonwealth nationals. And the next 3 categories, yes, this person has a national registration card, but that has not been seen. So they've confirmed there's a card, but that has not been seen. So if you look at these 2 questions, the recommendation is you under P34, we'll see that options 1 and 2 is actually verified. So this birth certificate has been seen, has been reported to be there, and the enumerator has actually seen this document. But 3 is actually capturing the lack of possession of this birth certificate due to the loss of this document. And then P36, we can also see that 1 to 3 is, yes, there's a confirmation of the presence of this document, and it has been verified. 4 to 6, this document is confirmed. It's reported that it is there, but it is not verified by the enumerator. And then we are also looking at 7 as having reported the lack of the document due to the loss of that document. 8 and of course the next one, 9, which is supposed to be 9, is somebody doesn't have that document, and then the 9 one is that they don't know. Let's proceed. So what we see on this slide is that the recommendation is under P35, whether the birth has been registered or not. There's a recommendation that we add another question to say this birth has been registered. I mean, has been yes, it's been registered and the forms have been submitted to the Department of National Registration and Passports and Citizenship. The second one is to say, yes, this has been notified at the health facility, so that we are able to disaggregate that data further. And then in terms of marriage registration, there's a marital question in the questionnaire, but there's also a recommendation to add a question as to whether this marriage has been legally registered, statutory registration or customary registration, so that at analysis level, we are able to disaggregate that variable further. So in conclusion, we see that we learn lessons from the Zambian census that questions on legal identity can facilitate analysis, subnational analysis on monitoring the proof of legal identity, as we have seen also from the presentation from Ramesh. And then it's important that pilot testing piloting and as well as enumerator training on the census of legal identity is very key to ensure data quality. And it's also important that including questions on the legal identity in the successive censuses provides a basis to assess inclusiveness of the legal identity system in all the decades. And I think that is it. So we acknowledge the contribution of all these institutions, Swedish CIDA, UNFPA, Center for CRVS System and University of Zambia, as well as UNDP to the success completion of this pilot study. Thank you, Chair. Over.
Thank you. Thanks, Chinyaman Somea, for giving us some lessons and sharing those lessons from Zambia in terms of capturing the right information. I know I was put here as a discussant, but we have very little time. But just to acknowledge that what we have had today is about methods of estimating possession of legal identity, whether you use direct or indirect methods, and the different sources of data we can use from censuses, from household surveys, or from administrative registration systems. But we have also seen that a number of factors impact on a possession of legal identity, such as age, and more so birth registration seems to lag behind because perhaps our children do not use those documents beyond, having the birth certificate. But adults seem to have IDs because they need to provide proofs at banks or in receipt of services that they need to access. So there are particularly good reasons why some may be higher than others. We've also seen that Zambia has progressed from pilot testing questions in a much simpler manner to a much complex manner in order to ensure inclusiveness, especially for immigrants and other populations that might otherwise be left out. So those are good lessons and also sharing of experiences. I think this was excellent. It's the start of a conversation around measurements, and definitely we can take it forward. And there have been a number of conclusions that we've heard about, and which can be taken forward with further interrogation of the data that we have, and of course to inform the other implementation processes as well. So it's often illuminating to hear such rich, experiences, but also analytics that we are trying to do in order to understand where we can intervene. So identifying those areas of or those gaps, for example, in terms of which population group is lagging behind, is also important in how we address, advocacy for improving legal identity and registration systems. So Francesca, I don't know if you had anything to add to conclude.
No, thank you all. It was really very, very interesting. I took a lot of notes, and as you said, Priscilla, this is just the beginning of the discussion. Mm-hmm. So looking forward to the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So a good applause to our colleagues for such rich experiences, and we look forward to hearing a lot more from other areas. Thank you and goodbye for now.